methodology. This paper will establish a possible theoretical framework for what I am calling education for the individual. The theoretical framework will use Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile to establish its basis. Criticisms of Rousseau will be addressed to determine factors that may be of consideration for the reader. Those criticisms have drawn me to focus on only two specific concepts that Rousseau outlines. The two concepts I will be basing this framework on are the ideas of three educators and two types of education. John Dewey's artist experience will also be heavily drawn from to supplement the framework for his perspective of art as a continuing process that acts as a placeholder and reflection of one's experiences. Once the framework is established, I will provide research on the effects of engagement with nature and information for how art can be used for a reflection for individuals. I will conclude with an introductory proposal for a methodology for researching the effects of natural environments for the individual. Review of the literature. Rousseau's Emile. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as a person in his work and how they relate, has been met with numerous controversies, and yet the works Rousseau has written keep getting turned over and over again to reassess their validity. Rousseau's Emile, or On Education, is no exception. Since Emile's first publication in 1763, despite the allegations, it has enjoyed a vast impact on education across the world. Throughout the years, educators have found new ways to perceive and apply Emile, showing that the work's relevance has applications beyond the controversies raised from it and Rousseau. The reassessments of Rousseau and Emile do not subjugate or excuse the controversies that have been found in Rousseau and his work, but rather certain points have been elucidated for current and relevant applications. With regards to the controversies raised pertaining to Rousseau and Emile, I set forth to continue the trend of reapplication in this paper as Rousseau's idea for the two types of education, the natural man and the citizen, and the three types of education, nature, things, and man, may prove useful for a theoretical grounding of education for the individual. Emile is a book that addresses Rousseau's concerns for the perception of children and how they are educated. The book is broken up into 5 smaller books, which each discusses a particular part of the pupil's, Emile's, life. The first book, in particular, sets the ground for Emile's education, although Rousseau's curriculum is expounded throughout. I will be focusing particularly on the first book as it includes the ideas of the 3 educators and 2 educations. That will be used as the basis for the framework I am proposing here. The overarching theme of Emile is children develop with certain aptitudes and needs at certain times of their life. Rousseau essentially is establishing a curriculum, predominantly for boys, but also includes short curriculum for girls, to address the perceptions of child development. Previous to Emile's publishing, the widespread assumption was that children were born with the same rationale as adults and only needed to be filled with information. As Baker puts it, furthermore, there is near unanimous agreement among historians, educational historians, and educators in general that Emile was a pivotal publication, turning educational attitudes and practices from a classical mode wherein children were treated as empty vessels to be filled with correct thoughts and behaviors to a romantic disposition which cherished children as complete yet unrealized entities requiring only careful nourishment as they matured into self-sustaining adults. Complete yet unrealized proposes that children progress going through a series of realizations and changes throughout their lives. For example, mentality, physical capabilities, social behavior, emotional competency, and widespread understanding of the world of a kindergartner is worlds apart from that of an upper-class high school student. It could be said in a child's completeness Their different faculties need to be exercised and strengthened to realize their faculties' full potential. This revolutionary idea of children progressing instead of being little adults propelled Rousseau to find the child's rights movement, which was spread by such writers as Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, Frederick Froebel, Elizabeth Peabody. Since Rousseau's time, the idea for children's progression has been explored and reaffirmed by psychologists and educators such as Freud, Vygotsky, Piaget, Erikson, Skinner, Gardner, and Lowenfeld, to name a few. The idea of child progression is portrayed throughout a fictitious prototypical child that Rousseau calls Emile. Rousseau explains in his own words, I take an imaginary pupil to assume on my own part the age, health, knowledge, and talents required for the works of his education, to guide him from birth to manhood when he needs no guide but himself. The use of a prototypical child, although affording the flexibility just mentioned, is the starting point for the criticisms of Rousseau. 3 points of clarification must be made about the use of Rousseau's Emile. The first is Emile was not originally published in English. Since Emile's publication in France, it has been translated a number of times into different languages, including English. As I have not read many of the translations, nor can I speak French or any of the other languages Emile has been translated into, I cannot comment on the validity of the translation, but I trust those who were chosen to translate were done so because of their qualification. The translations have been used for this paper is in English and translated by B. Foxley. A second point of clarification is on the disparity between the context of Rousseau's time and today. Rousseau wrote Emile in the mid-1700s, which held a very different worldview from today. The dissolution of the perceptions held today from the 1700s requires some sensitivity. There are definitely a number of ideas that Rousseau offers that may be seen as improper or offensive to perceptions of today. To provide a few examples, Rousseau was a middle upper class statesman in a predominantly white-powered society, and the acceptance of different races, cultures, and gender equality were not yet addressed. As a final clarification, this paper will address the Christian perception of Rousseau. The Christian perception that is included in this paper is necessary to understand Rousseau's perspective of education. The idea of education for the individual and the role of nature in education for the individual. As such, I ask the reader to consider these clarifications while reading the paper and the pertinent information related to illustrate the topic. Criticisms of Rousseau and Emile. The obvious difference between the mid-1700s society when Rousseau wrote Emile as compared to today's society aside, Rousseau's use of the prototypical child is immensely off-putting, especially in the context of this paper, which intends to propose a theoretical framework for educating the individual. The individual criticisms arise from Rousseau's relationship with the children that were biologically his. The second criticism has to do with Emile being as a prototypical child. Third is the controversy that comes with Emile being a boy and the criticisms that Rousseau proposes for girls. Fourth, in the dualistic perspectives Rousseau provides for Emile's education. A final criticism deals with Rousseau's Christian basis for Emile, while being addressed in the onset of the groundings for the theoretical framework. A point of contention is also addressed before the basis of the framework, defining Rousseau's idea of evil to better serve the understandings of how his ideas for the 2 types of education and 3 educators are relevant for an education for individuals. Before I address the criticisms of Rousseau and Emile, I feel it important to reiterate that this paper addresses 2 ideas of Rousseau, specifically the 3 educators, nature, things, and man, and the 2 types of education, natural man and citizen. I by no means imply through the use of these ideas that I agree with everything that Rousseau believes or what he proposes in Emile, nor do I suggest that these criticisms be ignored or discredited. Therefore, I address the following criticisms with the faith that the concerns for education for the individual outweigh the misgivings of Rousseau and Emile. Rousseau's children. One of the most upsetting realizations pertaining to Rousseau in relation to Emile deals with how Rousseau treated his own children. Although Rousseau concedes in Emile, he who cannot fulfill the duties of a father has no right to become one, it does not excuse him from the fact that he immediately consigned each of his own 5 children to a foundling home. The paradox of Rousseau giving up his children and writing Emile has long been grappled with, and many propositions have been made to defend Rousseau, but due to the non-existence of any formal documentation on the issue, all that is known for certain is Rousseau's actions with no illumination to why. Matthew Menham, 2015, has also recently taken up a comprehensive and systematic exploration pertaining to the issues related to Rousseau and his children in the article Rousseau's Discarded Children. But even through his own admission, his study does not draw comprehensive conclusions, but lays a foundation for responsible discussion of this sad and bizarre chapter of intellectual history. Menham arranges the different reasons for Rousseau putting his children in a children's home thematically. The reasons range from the strongest defense, I would not have been able to bring them up, to most heinous, I would do it again, with much less doubt too, if I had to do it again. The dates for these reposts range throughout Rousseau's life, extending in 1778 when he died. Menham arrangement of the different descriptions found were organized in relation to the different works Rousseau was doing. During the Emile era, it seems that the exploration Rousseau offered were more accepting and penitent. Rousseau alludes to the idea that Emile was written in retribution for the injustice he did to his own children. As Menham's article shows, the relation of Rousseau's actions questions his character and the intentions of Emile. There are those who, because of Rousseau's actions, have disqualified Emile as a comprehensive or applicable work for education, relegating his actions as hypocritical or not practicing what he preached. There are others who recognize Rousseau's actions but see Emile as something apart from or a production of his actions. Yet still for others, the irresolvability of the paradox generated from Rousseau's discarded children has, as Menham attests, caused many to avoid the topic altogether.
Do more, do better.